So sometimes you need a track to have added brightness to help it cut through a mix, but you go and use additive EQ, and it adds a lot of unwanted harshness and unwanted brightness to your track, so it just kind of makes everything sound a bit thinner. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you an alternate way of using distortion instead of additive EQ to help your elements feel fatter, so to provide a bit more punch and fullness in the mid-range, which is a pretty common EQ boost to do on a lot of different elements. Then I'll also be showing you how to make everything sound a bit brighter with distortion as well, which would replace a high frequency or high shelf boost, which could sometimes make your sounds a little thin and unnecessarily harsh. So the first note before we begin is you want to use a nice distortion effect, preferably one with a dry-wet control, so that you can blend in the original signal with a distorted signal for optimal results. Ableton Live's built-in effect, the saturator, is really great for this type of thing, but there's also some really excellent VST plugins that I use for this type of distortion processing all the time, which is what I'll be doing today. But if all you have is the saturator inside of Ableton Live, or some sort of built-in tube saturator inside of your digital audio workstation, you could use that plugin. Just I'd recommend having something that has a dry-wet control on it. So this video will be using two different effects plugins. The Soundtoys Little Radiator, which models a Altec tube preamp, has a dry-wet control on it. It's very nice and crunchy sounding. And then we will also be using the FabFilter Saturn multiband distortion plugin. So first, let's go ahead and listen to our simple mix here. This is basically just kind of the raw tracks with some simple EQings. So this piano has some EQ that we've done in one of the previous videos. Then the electric guitars have a little bit of reverb on them. But let's go ahead and listen to where our bass is sitting in terms of our mix. So it sounds nice, but it could use a little bit more fatness to make it sound a bit more full. And it could also use just a touch of harmonics and brightness to help it cut through the mix. So if you're on a speaker system that isn't as good, you could still hear that bass come through on your system. So let's go ahead and use some distortion to create this effect. So this is what that bass sounds like on its own. So normally what I would do is reach for a EQ, and I would boost kind of the low frequencies and then the high frequencies. But let's use a distortion plugin to do all of that in one go. So we'll use the Soundtoys Little Radiator. And the way that I do this, we can just turn off the noise emulation here because we don't need it in this case. But the way that I do this is I adjust the distortion amount, which in this case is labeled heat. This just increases the amount of tube distortion on our signal, and then I'll blend that in with the original dry tone. So basically I start off on kind of this default state, and then move it up until we get something that's nice and crunchy, and then we'll blend it in. So it's definitely too much. Something there, we get a really nice kind of full sound. We get a bit more crunch on the bass, and those high frequencies start to come through. And we're also getting a bit of a volume boost as well here. This definitely changes the character of our sound quite a bit and becomes pretty distorted, which stylistically, if you want that, you can always leave it as is. But the way that I usually like to apply this effect is I start off on the dry, and then we can play it back with the whole mix, and then I'll increase the wet amount here until we get kind of that added brightness and added fullness. So you could hear that mid-range is a bit boosted comparatively to where it was. And we also get a little bit of added high-frequency harmonics. So this makes that sound a little bit fatter and helps it cut through the mix just a little bit better. And all we've used here is just one distortion plugin, created a more crunchy version of the sound, and then just blended that in with the original. If I turn this all the way up, so we got an extremely crunchy sound, and I blended that in, you get even more brightness and even more of that kind of fat, saturated tone. So you can either use this in more of a subtle way just to add a little bit of harmonics, or you could use it in a more drastic way to really liven up your mix to add quite a bit of harmonics. So it just depends on stylistically what you're going for. But I'll put that at something a bit more subtle. So next, let me show you the same effect really quickly on these electric guitars, which on their own sound pretty weak and thin. So let's go ahead and go over to our guitar bus. I went ahead, loaded up, copied the little radiator, and we can do the same thing. So we have that 100% wet, and I'll increase this until we get just a little bit too much distortion. And then we'll adjust the dry wet. So it's adding again a little bit in the mid-range, and then also adds on that crunch on top of everything. So keep in mind there is a bit of a volume change here as well. So this is increasing the volume of the overall sound. But you can hear, especially on the top end of those guitars, there's a lot more crunch and a lot more harmonics, which helps them cut through the mix because they've got a bit more bite to them. So it makes everything a little bit easier to hear. Then the final kind of distortion trick for mixes that I want to show you is how you can use a multi-band distortion to provide an even more subtle but equally as effective technique to brighten or liven up an element. So let's take these acoustic guitars as an example here, which on their own just sound like this. And the low mid-range on these sounds quite nice, but they're definitely lacking a lot of those upper high frequencies, and it's definitely more of a main element in this track, and this really needs to be a bit brighter and to punch through the entire mix. So what we'll do here is split the frequencies and apply just some distortion to just the top end frequencies to give it just a little bit more air. So we can open up our multi-band distortion here, and you can really use any multi-band distortion unit. I just like the way that this one works. Then we'll go ahead and create two different bands. We have a low band, which is the low frequencies, and then we have a higher up band, which will be all of those upper high frequencies. Maybe grab everything kind of more in the upper range, about 4,300 or so, maybe 4,004. And then on the low band, we don't want any distortion, so we could turn that off. And then on the high band, let's go ahead and load up something nice and crunchy like the clean tube distortion. So that way it adds lots of nice, rich harmonics to the signal. And then let's go ahead and increase this drive just a little bit to just add a bit of crunch just to these upper high frequencies. So here that's quite a bit. We'll maybe take that down to about there. So you can hear with this example, this sounds like a high shelf boost. So before, it kind of has this dull characteristic to it. And then after, it has a lot more brightness and a lot more harmonics in the top end, which makes this guitar sound nice and airy. Whenever this is dropped back into the whole mix, it sounds like this. And this helps that acoustic guitar be more in the forefront of that overall mix. Because this guitar is kind of the main element of the whole track, we want to make sure that that element is very clear and easy to hear all the different parts of it, because that's kind of carrying the main melody of the whole track. Another added bonus is because these high frequencies are a lot easier to hear now, we can actually reduce the volume of that acoustic guitar, because we don't need to turn it up as loud in order to hear it effectively inside of our mix. We can hop on over to our mixer and just bring down the level of that. So this multi-band trick is very, very helpful whenever you're working with an element where you don't really want to change the overall characteristic of it. You just want to kind of lighten and brighten everything up. You could also do something like a mid-range boost where you pick out a specific frequency for something like a snare, for example, and you could add just a bit of crunch to just that frequency to help it cut through your mix a bit better. This multiband technique can also work well on vocals as well. You just want to be careful of the sibilants that you may be adding because of that high frequency boost, so you may need to drop in a de-esser after that distortion unit if you are using this on a vocal, because it could get a little bit harsh if you're not careful. So this alternate way of boosting frequencies by adding harmonics helps everything cut through a mix and helps everything sound a bit fatter as well because of that added richness. There are instances where EQ boosts are a great option for your mix. I just wanted to show you an alternative way of approaching things that you can use if an EQ boost isn't working on a specific mix. So if you're working on a track, you try to boost some frequencies, and it just makes everything sound brittle and harsh, and it's not giving you that nice bright top end that you're looking for, try out using distortion and adding harmonics to your signal to create that top end boost if EQ isn't working for you.